Thank y'all for joining today. There's a lot of news to talk about. I want to try to keep this short and relatively informal to take as many questions as possible. First, let's talk about something that happened a short time ago, but given all the intervening events, many people have not paid sufficient attention. Nashville's disaster request from the president. He only signed Part B, which was the security assistance. He did not sign the part about debris removal. We have found no explanation from the White House on that. They, took over 10 days to sign, part of it. So we're hoping he will complete the job. Second, COVID relief. That bill finally passed Congress, and it will contain billions of dollars for vaccine rollout, which should help relieve some of the problems that we're seeing. Hopefully more Tennesseans, more Americans can get the vaccination. It's worth noting Dr. Hildreth's recent tweet, because he's one of the nation's and the world's leading experts, and he was warning against just going ahead and having everybody get the first dose and not being as prepared as we should about the second. Third, the events that are closer at hand. Many of you know that I was in Washington on last Wednesday for voting. I will be going back shortly for the votes we'll have this week. My chief of staff was in the office as well, Lisa Quigley, who's on the call. Both of us are pretty experienced on Capitol Hill. We've seen a lot. We've seen countless protests, but we have never seen a riot, much less an insurrection like this one. It very quickly got out of hand. Pretty soon, the Capitol Police were texting us, sending out the audible alert in the hallways to shelter in place. And it was more like barricade the doors. It was keep silent, lest you draw any attention from any of the people roaming the hallways. So we quickly locked the doors and barricaded ourselves in the office, as most everybody did on Capitol Hill. The aftermath of that, of course, we will have a vote tomorrow on invoking the 25th Amendment, because Republicans objected today by unanimous consent to going ahead and asking the Vice President to start that process. As y'all know, the 25th Amendment is not very well written for this sort of situation. It's more for a medical condition, something like a coma or a stroke, something like that. But it can be fitted to this. I've been disappointed. A number of cabinet members have already quit, basically saying they didn't want to vote on the 25th Amendment applying to Trump. The bigger vote will be the next day, the second impeachment of President Trump. It will pass the House of Representatives. We don't know what the Senate will do, but it's really a shocking situation in which we see actually presidential level incitement. There's also some incitement from our colleagues, folks like Mo Brooks, who's from Huntsville, Alabama, but other colleagues have been involved as well, denying the legitimate outcome of the election, pretending that Joe Biden is not the president-elect, trying to subvert the electoral process. So there are two things that I think are sometimes overlooked in the stories. One is that the transition period for democracy is our most vulnerable time. Compound that with holidays, and you really have a field day for people who wish to do America ill. And then one of the few days in the calendar that is actually designated by the Constitution is January 6th, the counting of electoral votes. And that's, of course, when the protest turned into a riot, turned into an insurrection. So I'm on every letter supporting the use of the 25th Amendment. I'm on every resolution to impeach the president. One of them is attached in the email that I think that you've already received, or that Katie will send you, as it's the letter proposing the use of the 25th Amendment. We never seriously expected Pence to comply, but we in Tennessee know better than probably the people of any other state. Sometimes the necessity of having a transition earlier we did that when Ray Blanton was governor of Tennessee. And then Speaker of the House, then Ray McWhorter, worked with incoming Governor Lamar Alexander to make sure that the havoc that Ray Blanton was producing was minimized. So those are a few thoughts. I'm happy to go into your questions. I appreciate your joining the call this afternoon. Our office stands ready to be as useful to you as possible. These are trying times, and hopefully we can get through them together. Who wants to go first? Katie, you want to call on the first one?
Yeah, thank y'all for your patience. This is just how we have to do it in the digital age. I'll call the news outlet and you'll have to unmute yourself and you can ask your question. First, we have AP.
Hey, Congressman, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Not to start off topic, but we had FBI searches of Republican lawmakers at the state level last week. I know the FBI doesn't go around tipping themselves off, but I was curious if you have been given any indication of what they're looking into or have any thoughts on that.
I have almost no information about that. I read it in the paper, heard it on the radio. It's very interesting. It's actually very sad how many times has Tennessee legislature been investigated by the FBI for corruption. I remember the phrase Rocky Top, and that wasn't the UT fight song. There are other investigations that have embarrassed our state. I'm sorry it's happening again.
One other quick question. There's a report that the FBI has put out a memo saying all 50 states could see sort of riots at their capitals. Have you seen that document, and what can you say about that?
I haven't seen the document, but I heard the news report, and we have to be frank. Tennesseans voted overwhelmingly for Trump, even the second time, when he got between 60 and 70% of the vote, especially in the outlying counties. So there's a terrific amount of anger and misunderstanding out there. As I've said, countless times, unfortunately, people are not doing their fact checking. They're believing utter fantasies. And I've used a story that I've heard, all over for most of my life, that things like there are alligators in the New York City sewers. We all know that's ridiculous. Alligators don't live that far north. But I was once visiting a Nashville public school where the kids not only all believed that, one of the kids had written a song about alligators in the New York City sewers. So that's probably a testament to our songwriting potential here in our community. But it's also a sign of how people love to believe fiction, and a nonfiction isn't nearly so popular.
Thank you.
Who's next?
Okay, so we'll go to the next one. It's Fox 17.
Hi there. My name's Erica Glover. I'm actually working on a story about block grant approval. So I wanted to ask you, of course, this changes how millions of people are going to get health insurance, especially for low-income residents. So what, if any, concerns do you have about the block grant approval, and do you support it?
I'm strongly opposed to it, and I appreciate your raising the question. I should have mentioned that in my opening statement. I forgot. I'm crafting a letter right now to ask the incoming Biden administration to reverse the waiver. The first point is that this waiver was snuck in the final days of the Trump administration. They had 18 months to approve this, and they decided to approve it in the final 12 days. That's suspicious enough. But in addition to that, they're trying to handcuff both the incoming Biden administration and all future public officials for 10 years by locking them into this waiver. That's just not fair. There's a secret side agreement that so far I've not been able to get a copy of that should be made available to everyone so we can see what the real deal is. But this is a very unusual form of approval for this waiver. And if you get into the substance of it, and I spoke out against this loudly in the public meeting that the governor had called in Nashville, it's really a way for Tennessee state officials to shortchange Medicaid recipients. It offers the possibility of savings from an unspecified source, and that money saved could be spent for non-healthcare purposes. When we already have an at-risk population in Tennessee that's huge, when we've already lost more hospitals than any other state per capita, it is absolutely wrong to further cut health spending in a state, especially during the middle of a pandemic. We don't know what other things the state could spend the money on. They specify they won't spend it on tourism or financial regulation or a few other categories, but that leaves them plenty of loopholes to jump through. So if Tennessee weren't already known as one of the leading hoarders, if not the leading hoarder of any state in America, you're aware of the Beacon Foundation study that pointed out we had $700 million already stockpiled of money that should be spent to help our poor people, especially during not only the pandemic, but during pretty vicious recession when so many people are thrown out of work. It's really shameful, in my opinion, that the state is treating Tennesseans as guinea pigs with this waiver request and denying the ability of future policymakers to change that. So I'm hopeful the Biden administration will step in and reverse the action, the last minute action of the Trump administration.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question.
Okay, we'll go to the Tennessean.
Hi, Congressman. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Hey, Maria.
I wanted to dig a little bit more into what happened last Wednesday, if you can. You know, we've seen some of this brand of extremism. We've had white supremacist rallies. Unfortunately, there are deep ties to this brand of extremism here in Tennessee that we've seen for a while now, and it's clear that Tennesseans were front and center at what happened at the Capitol. As the investigation continues into this, and even questions about this have been raised but not confirmed in connection to the Nashville bombing, what can you say about what you're feeling as a representative of the state now, and why Tennessee seems to play host to this?
Well, I haven't done a survey, but it looks like most every state has this element in it. First, we need to carefully distinguish between peaceful protest, which is an honored and worthy American tradition, and then this sort of violent rioting that, even when you're contesting the results of a peaceful election, turns into insurrection. So I hope that these people can find a better way to express their frustration and concern. I hope they listen to facts more. I hope they're kinder to their neighbors, because the abuse they leveled on the Capitol policeman was appalling. The videos are really hard to watch. I really praise our men and women in uniform because they took terrific and unjustified abuse. All they were doing was doing their job, and they really got hammered in that riot. So Americans need to know that we live in the best country on earth, and it's our job to keep it that way. And you do that by working peacefully within the system, peaceful protest. And I hope that Americans will come to their senses very soon. I'm encouraged that the business community is finally stepping up, whether it's the tech platforms or whether it's the companies that donate, and finally cutting off the river of money that's been going to these misguided people.
Just a short follow-up on that. Why do you think it took something like this to reach that point, if that's what you think should have happened sooner?
Well, a lot of the business interests love the tax cuts. They love the cuts in regulation, and they kind of took the bad parts of the Trump administration, including the crazy tweets, just as the price of their own greed. Sometimes it takes a mishap or an accident before people come to their senses. I think in retrospect, we may be lucky that the insurrection was so poorly planned that, it's not just a wake-up call. It's kind of like a minor heart attack that our country has suffered that will help people appreciate our democracy more and appreciate our peaceful transition of power, because that's something that many people took for granted. I myself had the counting of electoral college votes in my previous times in Congress was a real snooze. Nobody bothered to show up. It's totally perfunctory. And this time it became genuine theater. And it took, 17 hours to do, and 7 hours of which Lisa and I were locked down in the office. So it's just crazy that the greatest country on earth would behave that way.
Okay, so we'll go on to WKRN News 2.
Who's next? News 2, can you hear?
Okay, they may not have a question, so we'll come back if they do. So next is Nashville Post.
Okay.
Hi, Congressman. On the block grant, what steps will the Biden administration have to take to reverse the approval? And then also, you mentioned a secret side agreement. What were you talking about with that?
Well, normally a new administration does not try to reverse the waivers that have been granted, but the conditions of this waiver are so suspicious, so last minute, so contrary to the Medicaid policy. And remember that Tennessee is basically an outlaw state already. We're one of only 12 states in America that has refused to cover, to expand the Medicaid coverage. And these are needy people. These are people below 133% of poverty. They need health insurance. And guess what? Everyone needs health insurance. You can't live in a country with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you don't have health coverage. And especially in the city of Nashville, we claim to be a healthcare capital, and we do a worse job of helping our people than almost any other city in the country. That is not acting like a healthcare capital. So I'm hopeful the Biden administration will do all that it can to reverse this waiver. Now, the lawyers in the Trump administration, as I've already said, tried to lock it in as best they could, almost making it a contractual commitment, which seems to me to be another sign that they're doing something suspicious. The side agreement, as I say, I haven't seen it yet. We've heard rumors about it. It seems to be yet another example of the suspicious activity on the part of the CMS Administrator Verma, who, guess what? In her own state of Indiana, when she ran the Medicaid program, when Mike Pence was governor, guess what she did? She expanded Medicaid. So we just asked to be treated as she treated her own state. That's all we ask, and that shouldn't be too much. But somehow that's been very difficult to do in Tennessee.
Okay, Stephen, did you also have a question for the post in the scene?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Congressman.
Hey.
What do you make of this discussion about possibly censuring or otherwise punishing your fellow members who supported, rejecting the votes?
Well, first of all, I think there should be a calm and sensible investigation, because it's hard to keep up with even a few members, much less 435. Mo Brooks did stand out by speaking at the president's rally right before the riot moved to Capitol Hill. There's a difference between playing politics and then playing with fire, because sometimes you play with fire and you set things on fire and do tremendous damage. So there has to be some sense of responsibility. Now, the 14th Amendment was not drafted with conditions like this in mind, but the language is strangely apt. So it's kind of interesting to have a refresher course on the Constitution that applies to so many of my colleagues when they're hitherto unaware of that application. So, but that's a complicated way of just saying, hey, if we all behaved like neighbors and obeyed the golden rule, we'd all be fine. This is not hard, because almost all my Republican colleagues that I've talked to admit that Biden won the election. They just want to be popular with the Trump supporters back home, what they call the base. And that's rank hypocrisy. In fact, it's demagoguery, but they're insisting on acting like that. So it would have been better if they'd calmly explained to the folks back home that, hey, in all 50 states, the votes were counted fairly, and Biden got exactly the same number of electoral votes that Trump got in 2016. And how is that a landslide for Trump, but not a win for Biden? It's craziness. But as I say, people's capacity for self-delusion is almost unlimited. And go to a bookstore today, and the fiction section is a lot more popular and larger than the nonfiction section. We all love fantasy, and there are different degrees on this, but the fantasies turned vicious and dangerous last Wednesday.
Okay, so we'll go on to WTVF Channel 5.
Hey there, it's Erin Ziegler with Channel 5. Thank you so much for taking our questions. Just thinking ahead of to Wednesday and the impeachment vote, and then moving ahead to the Senate, after what we saw, what happened at the Capitol, our Tennessee senators, flip on to not challenge Biden. And do you think the impact and the gravity of what happened could impact what happens in the Senate on this next vote for them?
Well, I was embarrassed by their prior views, but I was glad that they changed their minds. Better late than never. I wish other senators had done that. Lindsey Graham's speech on the floor was particularly notable because he's been complicit with Trump for 4 years, having denounced him 5 years ago when he was running against him, and now he just threw in with him. But to some extent, it's a little bit like rats leaving a sinking ship. They realize that, hey, maybe they were wrong. I wish they'd seen the error of their ways earlier. Now, every elected official gets to pick how they choose to represent their people. Every state is different, and it's very different to be statewide than it is to have a smaller district. But even making those allowances, I wish that they lived up to the tradition of a Howard Baker, who spoke truth to power, even when that meant the downfall of his own party's president, Richard Nixon, because he dared do the right thing. We used to have more senators who dared to do that, and we still have Mitt Romney, but even a Pat Toomey is late coming around. Sadly, some of those who called out the president early, like our own Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, they chose retirement over contesting a primary because already they viewed the Trump base as that strong. They were afraid to take them on. So there's no substitute for getting the truth out there. And that's why I'm so thankful for our media friends. That's what you try to do every day. And it's hard to do, but it's absolutely necessary. I love the Jefferson quote, given the choice between government without newspapers or newspapers without government, he would unhesitatingly choose newspapers without government. Of course, there was no electronic media back then, and we have to have the media. It's even more important than government. And sadly, many people in the Trump base are just anti-media in general, unless it's their parlor or their other. Who knew that Fox would be viewed as too centrist for them? It's a crazy world.
Okay, so we'll go on to the power poll if you have a question. Okay, then we'll go.
Maybe we should single out that power poll result because I thought that was striking. As somebody I know said, it's the most beautiful pie chart they'd ever seen. I think it was, 85, 90% of Nashville insiders or business leaders thought that both our senators made a terrible mistake. That's greater unanimity than I've almost seen on any issue ever. And it came at a crucial time. So that's probably not a scientific poll, but at least a large focus group. And that's a pretty amazing result. So I hope that sends the senators a message, maybe not to repeat their mistake in the future.
Okay, we'll go on to Tennessee Lookout.
Yes, Congressman Sam Stockard with Tennessee Lookout. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, checking to see Congressman Steve Cohen just sent out something saying he felt the Electoral College should be abolished because of all the problems it caused this time and the fact that it's not a couple of times elected the person who received the majority of the votes. What's your take on that?
I agree that it's time to get rid of the Electoral College. For democracy to work, it's got to be widely understood. And the only rule that people really understand is majority rule. Now, you always need to protect the interest of the majority, but the Electoral College of the minority, the Electoral College is outmoded, and there are ways of fixing it short of a constitutional amendment, which is a daunting process. Each state could have proportional allocation of the Electoral College votes. That would make it much fairer. But now with the current winner-take-all system, it's really outmoded. It serves really only as a tiebreaker, and it's almost impossible to explain to people. And it was never one of the finer parts of the Constitution when it was written.
Now, do you also, talking about this, these things that could be happening in the next few days with people in these militia groups storming state capitals, do you feel the Tennessee governor should mobilize the National Guard in advance?
Well, that's his job, not mine. I don't know the threat environment here in Tennessee. I do know that the Capitol was well guarded, perhaps too well guarded before, when they were incredibly peaceful protesters, trying to camp out just on the skirt of the Capitol. Every governor is going to have to make their own decision. That's the glory of America. We have a 50-state federalist system. But our nation's capital, above all, should be protected, especially during this time of transition. You know, it's so sad that we had to worry about our own citizens attacking our capital when the real threat is actually from abroad. Only the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans liked what they saw on TV. It was a very sad moment for our country, and hopefully it will not ever be repeated.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go on to the Tennessee Holler.
Hi, Congressman.
Hey,
How are you? So, sort of a two-part question. One is, on Sunday, Representative Clyburn sort of floated the idea that the impeachment vote would happen, and then they would hold the articles to let Biden focus on his priorities for about 100 days. I'm wondering what you think about that idea. And then also, since there were so many hearings into Benghazi, we've seen that people reporting that Republicans don't have an appetite for hearings for what happened to really look into what Trump's role was. I'm wondering if you think serious hearings are warranted.
absolutely, serious hearings are warranted. And thankfully, with the Georgia outcome, we will have a democratically controlled Senate, at least for certain aspects of the Senate work. Remember, that's an anti-majoritarian institution. It takes 60 votes to do most of the Senate's work, but for a few things, 51 votes are sufficient. The trouble with the impeachment thing is it's designed to oust a sitting president. When the president is already left office, it's much less effective, although you can still put a ban on future service. I do have great respect for the agenda of the incoming president. If we're going to be effective as a party, we have to be coordinated and efficient. And Joe Biden is the leader of the Democratic Party now, so we should give extra weight to his wishes. Also, you know, when you lose your main legal argument and the president has left office, the Senate trial becomes less meaningful. I wish the Senate, of course, would go ahead and have the trial almost immediately, because the facts are all over TV. Everybody saw it with their own eyes. It's not like you have to get witnesses like you had to for the Ukraine phone call or things like that. But it seems unlikely, of course, that Mitch McConnell is going to move anything. He's hiding behind the unanimous consent requirement of the Senate. If any one senator objects, then nothing happens. But I think Schumer will be much more effective at organizing the Senate, but it will take him a little while to get around it, because it's a confusing body. And certainly the first 100 days of any new administration is extremely important. We need to be showing the average American, whether they're a Trump voter or not, we're on their side, we're helping them. My favorite preference would be a large infrastructure package, because that's been traditionally the best way to get people fired up and excited and created jobs and building a stronger, better country.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks.
we'll go on to WPLN.
Sorry, I was muted just like I am on our newsroom calls. I have two quick questions. I guess I think they're quick. One is, looking back at, impeachment last go round, you were a little slower than a lot of your Democratic colleagues. And at one point had called, it a waste of time to impeach the president at that point. I know you came around, but what is it to you that is so much less of a waste of time, even though, as you point out, the president's on his way out the door and might be gone before anything even happened?
Well, first of all, I enjoy hearing your stories on Washington Public Radio. I'm glad that you're so often nationwide. That's awesome. Second, I think you're mischaracterizing the time for my impeachment support before. I supported impeachment exactly the same day that Nancy Pelosi did and other House leaders. You have to have the evidence before you can move to impeach. And with something complicated and kind of secret like the Ukraine phone call, there are not many people privy to that information in advance. The difference now is this is the most blatant attack on the US Capitol since the War of 1812. It was instigated that very day on live television by the president and by many of his minions. So this is a clearly different situation. This affects everyone in our democracy. It was live on TV. We all saw it. And my judgment is that the president should be removed from office. Of course, he should have been removed before, but we couldn't get the Senate to convict. So many people still think that impeachment is somehow a judgment. Impeachment is an indictment, and it takes the Senate trial to convict.
My one other question is just to follow up on the TennCare block grant. You know, you talk about this secret side deal, which there must be something, because there's not all the particulars, obviously, there in plain writing. But couldn't it be that it will actually expand? I mean, the way it's written, it should expand benefits, might even expand the number of people on TennCare. Is there a reason you don't believe TennCare?
Well, get me right, I love saving money, but not at the expense of the poorest people in our state and people who are already suffering from unemployment and a pandemic. You could cut the benefits in half and cover everybody in Tennessee. Have you heard any Republican state legislator express a strong interest other than Senator Briggs of Knoxville in covering everybody in Tennessee? I haven't heard that enthusiasm.
I guess the thing is, the agreement itself that we know of says you cannot cut benefits, and TennCare's math suggests it's probably going to bring in hundreds of millions of new federal dollars to the state, essentially, that we've already convinced the feds that we are saving them, which seems like a net gain for TennCare. So what am I missing?
Well, the state wants credit for having been a cheapskate in the past, and they want credit as if that were a savings. And again, I like thrift, I like efficiency, but I also like covering all of our citizens with decent healthcare coverage. And I haven't seen any indication from the state legislature that they're excited about doing that. The closest we came was Governor Haslam's plan. And remember, he was a good Republican. But in the special session called to pass his plan, he didn't have the clout to get a minister to give the opening prayer that supported his plan. He was denounced from the first words. So it's just somehow a difficult political problem in Tennessee. It's a little bit like mask wearing. For several weeks there, we've been at one of the worst COVID states in America because people have refused to wear masks or socially distance. I would encourage y'all to visit some of the rural counties outside of Nashville. You rarely see a mask worn there. And that's where the cases are spiking. We have to take better care of each other, and healthcare somehow has been a particularly contentious issue, and it should not be if we're going to be a healthcare capital. Our hospitals want decent public health measures. They don't want to be over full, and we're reaching crisis stages right now because both our state legislature refusing a mandate and encouraging all sorts of, non-mask wearing and refusal to fund decent health benefits has not been helping the public health in Tennessee. We are not a shining example of a healthy state. We could be doing much better than we are.
Thank you.
Okay, that was our last question. If you have closing remarks.
Well, you're very kind. I've kept you another 10 minutes beyond what I thought, but y'all know how accessible I am. Katie doesn't like this, but everybody's got my cell phone number anyway. So if you have a pressing question, you're welcome to call 615-714-1719. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a pressing question because I get a lot of pretty loopy phone calls from people. I'd much rather hear from y'all. So, but clear communication is an essential part of representation. I want the communication to be both ways because it's so easy for misunderstanding to grow. It's so easy to make a mountain out of a molehill. And, I just want clear communication. So I'll do my best to work toward that. I appreciate so many of you joining the call today. And I'm going to get on the road shortly.